matter how technologically advanced armies become, and certainly the U.S. military is an example of that, weather does play a major factor.
National Geographic's Peter Arnett is back in Baghdad. For decades, he's been covering wars around the globe. And as the military buildup intensifies around Iraq, he's got one eye on the looming conflict, another eye on the weather.
By April, early April, temperatures in the Kuwait, southern Iraqi area rise above 100 degrees. The Pentagon has made no secret of the fact that it would like to launch a war before April, when the weather does get very warm.
The United States has the most advanced military in the world, with bombs that can see through clouds and soldiers that can see in the dark. This mightiest of fighting machines is preparing for any and all action that comes its way. Far from the buildup in the Persian Gulf, in the middle of South Carolina, another part of the mission is taking place.
We support combat operations 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, right here from this office.
How low is the ceiling?
Their critical support comes in the form of very precise, extremely accurate weather forecasting. As General Eisenhower once declared, weather is not neutral.
So something is out there.
Throughout history, the most successful battle planners have taken care not to underestimate the forces of nature.
Weather has been important to combat since the first days of combat, literally BC.
2,500 years ago, the famous Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War that preparing for weather in battle is as important as preparing for the enemy. General George Washington took advantage of cold weather, crossing the icy Delaware and surprising the enemy in a turning point of the Revolutionary War. In 1812, Napoleon took too little account of the weather when he attempted to conquer Russia. His army was forced to retreat in the face of bitter cold and heavy snows. But just 3 years later, Napoleon blundered again, this time at Waterloo, with disastrous results.
He waited until the weather cleared after a rainstorm so that he could better position his troops. By allowing the mud to dry, the British and their allies were able to outflank him and defeat him.
An accurate weather forecast might have changed Napoleon's strategy, but the first forecasts were anything but accurate.
One of the first weather forecasters to exist in the United States went to President Lincoln and said, you know what, you can save lives and end this war sooner if you use weather information to your advantage. Turns out he was totally wrong. He forecasted clear skies for a week and it was raining for 3 days straight, and President Lincoln dismissed the idea totally.
By 1870, with the beginning of a national weather service, these crude anemometers were set up across the country, and daily reports were being sent to Washington. Al Moyers is the Air Force weather historian.
Weather has always affected battle. It's only been in the 20th century that we've truly been able to do something about that by improvements in both the art and science of weather forecasting.
By the time World War II rolled around, with its increased emphasis on aerial combat, newly created weather squadrons were providing late-breaking observations for the troops.
To fly or not to fly? That's the question weather can decide, and often does. Who's responsible for all this soup outside? Well, I'll tell you, our weather officer. He sure hit this one on the nose, and here we are, socked in, but good.
In these pre-satellite days, the data collected by the pilots was critical for air assaults. But even with the new technologies, forecasting often missed. During the invasion of the island of Tarawa in the Pacific, the tides came in 2 feet lower than predicted. Landing craft were stranded, and 1,000 Marines died trying to wade ashore. A year later, history's most famous forecast resulted in the decision to launch D-Day. General Eisenhower, a great believer in weather forecasting, had conflicting needs from the different services as to what would be ideal weather for an invasion.
The naval forces needed a low tide in order to conduct their amphibious assault. The air forces needed clear cover so that they could successfully bomb the reinforcements along the coast. The land forces wanted the cover of darkness to get in place. The paratroopers wanted moonlight in order to successfully conduct their paradrops behind enemy lines.
And complicating all these objectives was the unpredictable spring weather in the North Atlantic. After one postponement, June 6th was determined to be the date. Even so, the weather was far from favorable. And the Germans, believing no one would be foolish enough to attempt a landing in such rough seas, were caught off guard. Another kind of challenge arose from tropical rains in Vietnam.
Decisions were made based on what's called the Monsoon in Vietnam. Major league air campaigns were started immediately with in great intensity because they knew that in 2 months they wouldn't have the opportunity because of cloud cover.
And according to Peter Arnett, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the Vietnam War, assessing the impact of bombing runs that were completed was difficult.
And in bad weather, rainstorms, it was almost impossible to determine the effectiveness of those bombers. And that would affect the ability to defend that base and could essentially prevent ground operations for weeks at a time.
Arnett's seen all kinds of weather in the decades of conflicts he's covered. But now he's returned to the site of one of his more unusual stories, where during the Persian Gulf War, the Air Force brass used his live broadcast to make decisions about bombing runs. A general later told Arnett,
"When you came up live, we looked at the sky behind you, and if it was clear skies, we'd readjust our strategy, or if there was cloudy skies, we'd readjust."
That's the latest in a series of cruise missiles that have been flying into Baghdad over our heads.
The difference today is that low-flying drones, high-flying satellite planes use satellite imagery that is instantaneously received at headquarters. So they don't need Peter Arnett going live in the backyard of the El Rashid anymore to pick the weather.
In addition to the clouds, the military is acting on other lessons learned the last time around. How Air Force bombs strayed off course because dust interfered with their guidance systems. How the Army's tanks were unable to roll when sand clogged their engines. And how the Navy had to recalculate duty rosters because of the extreme heat on aircraft carrier decks. This time around, they're determined to do it better. And more sophisticated weather forecasting is part of that strategy.
It's not that generic forecast that you get on the TV, rain tomorrow. We have to tell them specifically when it's going to start, when it's going to end, how heavy it's going to be, how strong it's going to be.
We have a very active weather pattern right now, especially over the Iraq and northern Saudi Arabia region.
You got Fort Eustis and Langley?
Even though Colonel Fronix and his 28th Weather Squadron are far from the front lines, they are right on top of the action.
We have access to every piece of weather data that would be accessible, whether I was 50 miles from the combat area or 8,050 miles away. Our forces who are deployed forward are able to reach back here to a non-combat zone where we are able to simply focus on the weather.
We've indicated an area of dust storms, restricting the visibility down to about 2 miles.
As the squadron watches this storm on their screens in South Carolina, it is sweeping through Kuwait, grounding helicopters, preventing ships from unloading, and generally making the troops' lives miserable.
The difficulty is forecasting the exact visibility, which is really the thing that matters. Is it going to be so bad that we can only see 1/8 of a mile? Or is it going to be modest, that we can see 3 miles? There's a big difference. If you can see 3 miles, you can conduct ground operations. If you can't see the foot in front of you, you really can't do a whole lot.
For the 3 carrier battle groups stationed in the Persian Gulf, the weather provides a special set of challenges for the Navy. You might think it would be cooler for sailors out on the water, but it's not.
It's a big black steel heat sink, and so the temperatures there have been measured into the 120, 140 degree range, and you have people moving heavy equipment, carrying 50 pounds of chains, and using steam catapults, and there's jet exhaust, and so you just got lots of heat sources in one spot. And so they have very specific stay times where these people can work on the flight deck. And so if you're doing 24/7 flight operations, in support of combat operations, you have to manage the rotation of your people on and off the flight deck.
And it's not just flight deck personnel who are affected by the heat. It's also the pilots and their planes.
For a bomber to take off of an aircraft carrier, it needs to have a lot of lift under the wings. The hotter the air, the less lift available, the faster you have to drive that aircraft carrier. Eventually you get enough lift and you can launch the airplane. If the winds are very light, finding the precise direction is very difficult to do, but it's important because you can only drive so fast.
The pilots can compensate to deal with the heat. But for those who may be forced to wear protective gear because of possible chemical or biological attacks, the heat factor is cause for concern.
What exactly would you say to those who are worried about the servicemen going out in the suits and in heat?
It dissipates heat more quickly, and it provides protection against all known or suspected chemical or biological agents out there. Our commanders understand what heat's all about, and they understand what heat stress is all about. And they build the confidence in their soldiers and in their command that they can accomplish their missions with this suit on.
The chemical personnel from the team can move
But at a Pentagon briefing last year, a soldier wearing the new gear fainted under the glare of camera lights.
Is different than TEU. If you were to... Will you okay? I'll just take her out here and get her some water. Why don't you guys go ahead and stand at ease? Those lights are pretty hot.
These suits are very close-fitting, and they're very suffocating, and very hot. You're just like being parboiled in a sense, in a bag in the heat. And so again, military commanders would much rather not fight a modern war in the heat of summer in the Middle East.
The military knows there may be no choice. The timing of their campaigns is usually decided by politicians and diplomats. That's why all branches of the military have been training in weather comparable to what they might encounter in the Middle East.
The United States government and the Pentagon initially wanted to launch war against Iraq in 2002, around September and October, in autumn, when the weather was getting cooler and they'd be able to function more effectively.
But here at Shaw Air Force Base, the motto for the 20th Fighter Wing is any challenge, anytime, anywhere. They train in all sorts of weather, so they are prepared to fight in all sorts of weather. No one, down the line, from the pilot to the maintenance crew, underestimates the importance of a good forecast.
I've had people tell me that if a commander has his choice, if asked what 2 people would he like to have beside him in a mission, number 1 is his intel person and the other person is his weather person.
So it's not surprising that so much care and attention is paid to weather briefings.
All right, sir, here's the briefing for the mission today. Looks like for most of the day we're looking at 2,500-foot ceilings. For their time on target this afternoon at 12:45, was giving them ceilings at 4,500 feet, the tops up to 8,000 feet. Looks like their best attack heading would be a heading of a 040 or 050. That's the best chance they do of actually seeing the target with infrared.
Translated, the sergeant means that with clear skies, pilots can use weapons guided by infrared or laser systems. But when bad weather rolls in, those weapons are inaccurate, and satellite-guided weapons must be used instead. In addition, the shortest route to and from the target must be plotted carefully. Captain Eden says his pilots want to know the weather around every henhouse, every outhouse, every anthill, and every molehill.
Obviously, weather is going to play a huge role into any mission that you're going to fly.
Major Mike Lay has been flying F-16s for nearly 10 years.
A valuable weatherman is indispensable kind of thing. I mean, if he is right on the mark, you can plan for that portion of the mission, and it can go as smooth as you plan for it to be. But if you've planned something different and now the weather, and you haven't really thought about how the weather's going to affect that, then now you can get caught by surprise, obviously, and not get your mission done.
Major Lay just returned from patrolling the no-fly zone over northern Iraq. And although he certainly doesn't underestimate the Iraqis, for him, there is a more insidious foe.
I would think that the weather sometimes is the biggest enemy of all, because I can't, I don't know what to expect. A lot of times I may know what to expect from my enemy, but I can't control Mother Nature.
Even in the Middle East, lightning can wreak havoc on high-performance aircraft because they depend on such sophisticated electronics. Each F-16 runs about $25 million. So the Air Force has developed special protections for the planes.
We have some static dischargers that we put on the trailing edges of the wings from there. Also, we have them on the slabs that are on the back. We also have them on the back side of the tail. So that's really our biggest preventive measure for any type of lightning strikes. It's going to try to redirect that away from the major components up front, mainly like the radar.
More than 2,500 miles away from Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, the Navy has its own weather forecasting center in Monterey, California.
Having that sort of precise meteorological information will give you an edge over an adversary. In fact, we call it a force multiplier. By having that information, you get more value, 110% of the value of your fighting force.
In order to get that edge, or force multiplier, the very latest in supercomputers crunch millions of bits of data collected from around the world.
You notice the satellite picture, it's looking pretty dry.
Yeah, most of the rain is over in the western part of Iran.
Just kind of focus our attention in one particular spot and try and neck down to very specific impacts and decisions that we can help.
And you can see there's definitely
both the Navy and the Air Force can transmit weather nonstop, even to individual units in the field. And high-tech equipment enables them to send information back.
Today's Gray Berets that were in Afghanistan 13 days after 9/11 were carrying such devices as this to do all the types of observation and weather data supplies to their combat commanders, thereby making themselves much more lethal and much more agile in today's modern combat environment.
But no matter how sophisticated the military's equipment, Peter Arnett warns not to underestimate the Iraqis and their familiarity with their own weather.
The main advantage the Iraqi military have is that this is their country, this is their terrain. They've fought all their wars in the desert. They've fought all the wars in the heat of summer. The American advantage is, of course, air superiority and superior, overwhelming weaponry. But on the ground, soldier to soldier, the Iraqi soldier definitely has a benefit in terms that he is related to the terrain, can function in the terrain, is familiar with it, and can handle the temperature extremes.
But the U.S. military says its precise forecasting and its ability to pinpoint operations specifically tied to those forecasts can trump all enemies but one.
If I choose to make Mother Nature my adversary, Mother Nature is going to win. The very nature of my business is to take advantage of what Mother Nature has to offer and allow me to win over an adversary like Saddam Hussein.